There is a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't look like loneliness. You are surrounded by people. Your phone keeps ringing. Someone needs advice. Someone needs money. Someone needs you to solve a problem. Someone needs you to listen. Someone needs you to stay calm, because everyone else is falling apart. And somehow, you became the person everyone depends on. At first, it feels like strength. People trust you. They come to you when things become difficult. They tell you things they don't tell anyone else. They believe you will know what to do. And perhaps you like being that person. Because being needed creates a strange feeling of importance. You begin building an identity around it. I'm the strong one. I can handle it. Everyone needs me. But slowly, something starts happening beneath the surface. You stop asking for help, not because you don't need it, because you've forgotten how. You become so accustomed to carrying everyone else's problems that your own problems begin feeling inconvenient. Someone asks how you're doing. You automatically say, I'm fine. Then you change the subject, because what would happen if you actually told them? What if you admitted that you're exhausted? What if you said, I don't know what to do? What if for once, you were the person who needed saving? That question can feel strangely threatening. Carl Jung spent much of his work examining the relationship between the conscious personality and the hidden parts of the psyche. And one of the most uncomfortable things about the human personality is how easily a role can become an identity. You don't simply help people, you become the helper. You don't simply stay strong, you become the strong one. And once that identity becomes important, you may begin protecting it. Even when it hurts you, you keep answering the calls. You keep solving the problems. You keep forgiving. You keep saying yes, because saying no threatens the image you've created. And eventually, people stop asking whether you have the capacity to carry something. They simply assume you will carry it. The person everyone depends on is often the person nobody thinks to check on. And this is where the psychological cost begins, because being needed can feel like love. But sometimes, people aren't attached to you. They're attached to what you provide. Your stability, your attention, your advice, your ability to fix things, your emotional availability. And when you finally become tired, the relationship can suddenly feel different. Not because you became selfish, but because the role you were playing was doing more work than the relationship itself. And perhaps the most disturbing realization is this: you may have spent years becoming indispensable. Because somewhere inside you, being needed felt safer than simply being loved. There is a subtle difference between being loved and being useful. When people need you constantly, it becomes easy to confuse the two. They call you first. They trust your judgment. They depend on your presence. And every time you solve something for them, you receive another piece of evidence that you matter. But what happens when you have nothing to give? What happens when you are exhausted? When you don't have the answer? When you don't have the money? When you don't have the emotional strength to listen? When you finally say, I can't. Sometimes, the reaction tells you more than years of affection ever could. A person who genuinely cares about you may be disappointed, but they still see you. A person attached primarily to what you provide may become frustrated with the version of you that can no longer provide it. And that difference can be devastating, because the strong person often doesn't realize how much of their relationships have been organized around their usefulness. They become the emergency contact, the problem solver, the mediator, the person everyone calls after an argument, the person who remembers birthdays, the person who gives advice at midnight, the person who absorbs everyone's emotional chaos, and then wakes up the next morning as if nothing happened. But the unconscious keeps score. Every time you suppress your exhaustion, something inside you learns that your needs come second. Every time you say yes while wanting to say no, you reinforce the identity. Every time you rescue someone from consequences, you teach yourself that their discomfort is more important than yours. Eventually, resentment appears, but resentment is strange. It rarely announces itself honestly. It may appear as irritation, emotional distance, short replies, a sudden desire to disappear. You tell yourself, people are taking me for granted. Maybe they are. But there is another question. Did you ever teach them that you would always be available? That question isn't meant to blame you. It's meant to expose the pattern. Because sometimes people don't intentionally exploit you. They simply adapt to what you repeatedly allow. If you always answer, they expect answers. If you always forgive, they expect forgiveness. If you always solve the problem, they stop learning how to solve it themselves. And slowly, your kindness becomes infrastructure. Everyone builds their life around the fact that you will hold something up. But nobody asks, what happens when the pillar gets tired? The most dangerous role is the one people praise you for never leaving, because eventually you may begin believing that your value depends on staying. Staying when you're exhausted, staying when you're disrespected, staying when you're emotionally empty, staying because someone says, "You're the only person I can count on." And that sentence can sound like love, but sometimes it's a responsibility disguised as affection. And once you realize that, you begin asking a much darker question. If I stopped being useful to everyone tomorrow, who would still want me around? That question changes the way you look at your relationships. Because once usefulness becomes part of your identity, you begin noticing how difficult it is to separate generosity from fear. You tell yourself you help because you're kind, and sometimes, and that's true, but sometimes you help because saying no makes you anxious. You fear disappointing people. You fear becoming unnecessary. You fear someone discovering they can survive perfectly well without you. And suddenly, helping isn't simply kindness anymore. It becomes a way of securing your position in someone's life. You solve their problems, so they keep returning. You become their safest person, so they don't leave. You make yourself indispensable, because somewhere inside you, being indispensable feels like protection against abandonment. This is where Carl Jung's idea of the shadow becomes uncomfortable, because your conscious identity may say, "I just care deeply about people." But beneath that identity, there may be another motive you don't want to acknowledge. You want to be needed, not because you're manipulative, but because being needed gives you something that simply being yourself may never have given you. Certainty. If they need you, they have a reason to stay, and that can become addictive. You begin entering relationships where people are broken, confused, unstable, or constantly in crisis, not consciously. You simply feel strangely comfortable there, because chaos gives you a role. Someone is drowning, and suddenly you know exactly who you are, the rescuer. But put that same person inside a relationship with someone emotionally stable, someone who doesn't need saving, and something strange can happen. They feel unnecessary. There is nothing to fix, nothing to carry, no crisis that proves their importance. And instead of experiencing peace, they experience emptiness. Some people don't know who they are when nobody needs them. That realization can be brutal, because perhaps you've spent years calling yourself strong, when strength was actually the only identity you were allowed to have. Maybe weakness never felt safe. Maybe asking for help once led to disappointment. Maybe vulnerability was ignored. So eventually, you learned something. Don't need, be needed. And the strategy worked. People admired you, trusted you, relied on you. But every survival strategy has a price. The more everyone depended on you, the less permission you gave yourself to depend on anyone. And slowly, you created the exact loneliness you were trying to avoid, surrounded by people, important to everyone, necessary everywhere, but known almost nowhere. Because they know the version of you that carries everything. They may have never met the version that sometimes wants to put everything down, And perhaps neither have you. There is another consequence of becoming the person everyone depends on. You begin attracting people who are comfortable receiving, but uncomfortable giving. Not always intentionally. Sometimes they simply learn the pattern. You listen, they speak, you understand, they complain, you solve, they return, and because you rarely ask for anything, they may never realize how much you are silently carrying. This creates an unusual imbalance. You know their fears, their failures, their relationship problems, their insecurities, the things they don't tell anyone else. But they may know very little about yours, not because they don't care, but because you trained the relationship to revolve around what they need. You became the person who asks, "Are you okay?" But rarely the person who says, "I'm not okay." And eventually people can become genuinely shocked when you finally break. They may say, "But you're always so strong," as if strength were a permanent condition, as if the person who carries everyone is somehow forbidden from becoming tired. That is the psychological trap. Once people build an identity around your strength, your vulnerability can look like a personality change. You cry, and they become uncomfortable. You ask for help, and they don't know how to respond. You become unavailable, and they accuse you of changing. You finally express resentment, and suddenly you're the difficult one, because everyone had adapted to the version of you that never complained. People often appreciate your strength until your strength stops being convenient for them. But there is another side, and it is darker. Sometimes you may secretly enjoy being indispensable, not because you want to control people, but because being needed protects you from confronting your own emptiness. As long as someone needs you, you don't have to ask what you need. As long as someone else's crisis demands your attention, you don't have to sit alone with your own. As long as you're fixing everyone else's life, you can postpone looking at yours. This is where the role becomes a defense mechanism. Helping becomes avoidance. Responsibility becomes distraction. Being needed becomes a way to never experience the vulnerability of simply being. And then, when nobody needs you, the silence becomes unbearable. A free evening. No calls, no problems, no one asking for advice, no emergency, no crisis, just you. And suddenly you don't know what to do with yourself. That silence can reveal something the constant demands were hiding. Maybe you weren't only helping people. Maybe you were also hiding inside their problems. Carl Jung's shadow often contains exactly what the conscious personality refuses to acknowledge. And for the person who has built their identity around strength, the shadow may contain the part that desperately wants to be cared for. The part that wants someone else to say, "You don't have to handle this." The part that wants permission to collapse, to rest, to be uncertain, to not know. And perhaps the hardest thing for the strong person to learn is that being cared for does not make you less valuable. It simply makes you human. There is a moment when the person everyone depends on finally realizes being needed is not the same as being known. People may know what you can do. They may know how reliable you are. They may know that you answer the phone, that you keep your promises, that you remain calm when everything falls apart. But do they know what scares you? What exhausts you? What you secretly resent? What you need when nobody is watching? That is where the loneliness becomes deeper, because you can be surrounded by people and still feel psychologically invisible. You become so skilled at carrying your own weight that everyone assumes you don't feel it. And eventually, you begin assuming it too. You stop recognizing exhaustion as exhaustion. You call it responsibility. You stop recognizing resentment. You call it disappointment. You stop recognizing loneliness. You call it independence. You stop recognizing fear. You call it strength. The language changes, but the underlying emotion remains. And this is where the shadow begins asking for attention, because the parts of yourself you continuously suppress don't disappear. They wait. The angry part waits. The exhausted part waits. The needy part waits. The part that wants to say, No, I don't want to do this. It waits. And the longer you ignore it, the more likely it is to emerge indirectly. You become irritated over something insignificant. You suddenly withdraw from people you love. You explode over a small request. You feel an intense desire to disappear without understanding why. The conscious mind says, I don't know what's wrong with me, but the unconscious may already know. You have been saying yes for too long, and eventually, every suppressed no starts demanding to be heard. Resentment is often the shadow of kindness that was never allowed to have boundaries. This is why the solution isn't simply to stop helping people. That would only create another extreme. The person who spent years giving everything may suddenly decide they need nobody. They cut everyone off. They become emotionally unavailable. They call it self-respect, but sometimes it's resentment wearing the clothes of independence. Real psychological balance is more difficult. You can help without becoming responsible for everyone's life. You can care without rescuing. You can listen without absorbing. You can say no without needing to punish anyone. And perhaps most importantly, you can allow other people to struggle without immediately rushing in to save them. Because sometimes your help doesn't actually help. Sometimes it prevents another person from developing their own strength. You solve every problem, and they never learn how to solve it. You absorb every consequence, and they never learn responsibility. You become their emotional crutch, and then wonder why they cannot stand without you. Sometimes rescuing people is another way of keeping them dependent. And perhaps that is the hardest truth for the person everyone depends on. You may have to stop proving your value by being necessary. Because if people only stay when you are useful, then what you have built isn't always connection. Sometimes it's dependence. And the question waiting underneath all of it is brutally simple. If you stopped carrying everyone tomorrow, would anyone finally notice that you were tired? There is a point where you have to confront something uncomfortable. Maybe the people around you aren't the only ones who created this pattern. Maybe you did too. Not intentionally, but repeatedly. Every time you answered a call when you were exhausted, every time you solved a problem someone could have solved themselves. Every time you said, "Don't worry, I've got it," you were teaching people something. You were teaching them that you would carry it. And eventually, they believed you. This is where responsibility becomes complicated, because blaming everyone else feels satisfying. They took advantage of me. Maybe they did. But self-awareness asks another question. Why did I keep giving them access to me in the same way? That question isn't about guilt. It's about agency. Because if your entire identity depends on other people changing, you remain trapped inside the same dynamic. You wait for them to notice, to appreciate you, to finally understand how much you've sacrificed. But some people will never notice. Not because they're evil, because people become accustomed to what is consistently available. A light that is always on eventually stops being noticed. A person who always helps becomes expected. A person who never complains becomes assumed to be fine. And this is where the psychological shift has to happen. You stop asking, how do I make them appreciate me? And start asking, why do I need their appreciation to justify what I give? That question cuts deeper, because sometimes the need to be appreciated is connected to the need to feel valuable. You give, they thank you. You solve, they praise you. You sacrifice, they admire you. And the cycle continues. But when the praise disappears, the giving can suddenly feel empty. That reveals something important. Maybe you weren't only giving, maybe you were trading. Your support for belonging, your strength for importance, your availability for security. And once you see that exchange, you can finally choose differently. Not by becoming selfish, by becoming conscious. You begin helping because you genuinely want to, not because you are afraid of what happens if you don't. You begin saying no, without creating a courtroom inside your mind. You let people experience consequences. You allow someone to solve their own problem. You let a friend be disappointed. You let someone misunderstand your boundary. And most importantly, you discover something terrifying. The world does not collapse when you stop holding everything together. Some people adjust. Some people leave. Some relationships become healthier. Some become distant. And that separation reveals the truth. The relationships that survive your boundaries were built around you. The relationships that collapse without your constant sacrifice may have been built around what you provided, and that can hurt. Because sometimes you don't lose people when you stop being useful. You simply discover what the relationship was actually made of. Carl Jung's path toward individuation was never about becoming completely independent from other human beings. It was about becoming conscious enough to distinguish who you are from the roles you unconsciously perform. And perhaps you have been performing the role of the strong one for so long that you forgot there was a person underneath it, a person who gets tired, a person who needs reassurance, a person who wants to be held, instead of always being the one holding everything together. And maybe the deepest form of strength isn't carrying everyone. It's finally being honest enough to admit when you cannot. There is something almost frightening about discovering that you are allowed to be ordinary, not the strongest, not the wisest, not the person everyone calls when something goes wrong. Just a person. Someone who can say, I don't know, I need help, I can't do this today, I don't have the answer. For someone who built their identity around being dependable, these sentences can feel like weakness, but perhaps they are the first signs that the role is finally losing its control over you. Because when you stop needing to be indispensable, you can finally discover whether people actually want you. Not your advice, not your money, not your emotional strength, not your ability to fix things. You, and that discovery can be painful. Some people may become less interested. Some may stop calling. Some relationships may become strangely quiet, but others may come closer. Because now there is room for reciprocity. You can listen and also be listened to. You can support and also be supported. You can care and also receive care. The relationship becomes less like a structure resting on one pillar and more like two human beings carrying something together. That is psychologically different. And perhaps this is what the shadow was trying to tell you all along. The part of you that was exhausted wasn't asking you to become colder. It was asking you to stop disappearing inside your usefulness. The part of you that felt resentment wasn't necessarily telling you to abandon everyone. It was telling you that something inside the relationship had become unequal. The part of you that wanted to disappear wasn't always asking for isolation. Sometimes it was asking for rest. And the part of you that desperately wanted someone to care for you wasn't weak. It was simply human. The person who is always needed eventually has to learn how to be loved without performing a function. That may be one of the hardest psychological transitions there is, because being useful gives you certainty. Being loved gives you vulnerability. When someone needs what you provide, you know why they're there. But when someone stays, even when you have nothing to offer, you have to trust something much less controllable. Their choice. And perhaps that is what you have been avoiding. Not being alone, but discovering whether someone would choose you without needing anything from you. So the next time someone asks for your help, pause. Not because helping is wrong, but because you need to know whether your yes is coming from love or fear, whether you are giving or proving, whether you are supporting or rescuing, whether you are being kind or simply terrified of being unnecessary. Because once you can tell the difference, your relationships begin to change. Some become stronger, some disappear, and some finally become honest. You realize you were never meant to carry everyone. And perhaps the most unsettling part is discovering that you don't actually need to. The world will continue, People will solve their own problems. Some will leave, some will stay, and for the first time, you may be able to sit in the silence without immediately asking who needs you. Just you, without the role, without the responsibility, without the constant need to be strong. And perhaps that is where you finally meet the person you had been protecting everyone else from.